2 keer 16 tot 19 miljard euro. Dat is geen flesje gratis bier, dat is geen krat gratis bier, dat is een hele gratis bierfabriek.
Ik heb heel hard gezocht naar die geldboom. Ik ben nog steeds aan het zoeken, maar ik denk dat de realiteit is dat we die niet gaan vinden.
All these debates about how will we find the money or where is the money, this is just irrelevant to the actual real questions of the economy.
Ik vind dat we vooral naar de uitgaven moeten kijken, niet naar belastingverhogingen. Maar tekort is nog steeds een tekort.
Sinterklaas bestaat. Daar zit hij, achter de tafel.
The reason why MMT is considered highly political is that it actually messes with the traditional debate between left and right.
MMT, dat is moderne monetaire theorie. Die laat zien dat landen met een eigen geldpers gewoon zelf kunnen bepalen hoe ze geld uitgeven. Ze hoeven daarvoor niet eerst belasting te heffen of geld te lenen. Sinterklaas bestaat. En die geldboom ook, legt Brad Scott uit. Dat is de overheid. Brad Scott is economisch antropoloog en journalist. In de tijd van de financiële crisis van 2008 werkte hij als broker voor een start-up. Hij verkocht zogenaamde exotische derivaten. En sindsdien probeert hij de werking van de financiële sector ook aan niet-ingewijden uit te leggen.
If you're in a household, you have a constrained budget and you get money in and then you can spend what you have. All right, and so people often use this metaphor to imagine the government like a gigantic household that's spending. And this is why in public debates about government spending, they always say, you know, how will you pay for it? Where will you find the money? And so on. This is all a metaphor when you're imagining that the government is a bit like you are. But the reality is the government is not like you are. In any country that has its own currency, the government pushes money into circulation through spending and then pulls it back out again. A good metaphor, if you're trying to understand MMT, is to think about squirrels and oak trees. So squirrels run around trying to collect acorns. And in many ways, in an economy, we as money users have that kind of feeling to us. We're running around trying to find money, trying to store it, and so on. And we often then imagine that the state is like a gigantic squirrel that's also trying to do that. It's just got, trying to grab acorns as well. In reality, the state is far more like an oak tree. If you think about an oak tree, it actually issues acorns. It actually wants the squirrels to take its acorns because that's how it spreads its power. That's how it spreads the forest. And it's very similar with nation states. They want people to take their money. That's how states provision for themselves. When they're pushing money out, they're getting stuff back. Okay, and then we're getting that money from them, and then we have private sector activity between ourselves. And so you should never imagine that the state has the same mentality as we do. The state wants you to take its money, and when you give it back, it's actually being destroyed. Another way to think about this is to imagine when you're issuing a promise to someone. A promise doesn't exist until it comes out of my mouth, or if I issue it out. So it's that act of me pushing the promise out is what makes it real. If the promise comes back to me, the person says, okay, I'm going to redeem this promise, it gets destroyed. I don't hold my own promise. It's only a real thing when it's outside of me. And it's similar with state money. When states issue money, it becomes real. But when it comes back, it's destroyed. All right? It doesn't exist anymore. They don't hold their own money, much like I don't hold my own promises. But of course, if you're one of those people in the normal economy, you will imagine metaphorically that the government's a little bit like you are. All right? And maybe you'll even experience a sense of moral horror when you hear that the government can actually spend money into existence. If you want to think about this in Copernican terms, Copernicus was a guy who said, hey, the sun doesn't revolve around the earth revolves around the sun. MMT has a Copernican vibe to it because it says, you think that when you're sending taxes to the government's using that to then spend. It sort of turns it around and says, actually, the government spends first and then taxes later. Now, for the average person, this might seem intellectual. Much like if you're a person in the 14th century and you see the sun, it seems to rise, it seems to go over you. It looks like it's going over you, right? So many people, they say, well, it seems like I pay taxes to the government in order for the government to spend. But the reality is the government doesn't need your taxes to be able to spend. Governments spend first and then tax later. But it's not described like that. And the reason why it's often not described like that is that especially conservative economists want to constrain the public imagination. They think if we actually describe the reality, it's going to open up the public ability to say things like, hey, you say we can't spend on education and healthcare, but you can. You can actually issue new money.
Om de werkelijke rol van de overheid te begrijpen, moeten we terug naar de basis. Naar wat geld eigenlijk is en waar het vandaan komt.
You have to kind of think about MMT coming from this tradition that's challenging a certain dominant economics way of thinking about money. When they're imagining money, they say, oh, it's some kind of thing that has value and we use it to trade with other people because they know that it has value. So money is metaphorically imagined as a kind of commodity that sort of passes between people. Now, commodity styles of thinking about money are highly common. It's the most dominant way that economists think about money. Often the way that they imagine an economy works is that they imagine that an economy is a whole series of these sort of solo individuals. If you think about Margaret Thatcher, for example, she had this statement. She said, there is no society, there are only individual men and women. Now, the alternative way to start thinking is to draw upon anthropology and the actual study of early human communities. And the reality is that the actual starting point of all economies is that human beings are deeply interdependent. They're locked into these networks with each other. But there's no such thing as a person who survives alone by themselves. You got to start to think about the sort of primal origin of economies is not solo individuals bumping into each other, trying to barter. You got to start by thinking, okay, the primal origins of economies are interdependent human beings stuck together. And in an ancient hunter-gatherer band, that's a very tight group. In our modern economies, it's been pulled apart into these much bigger, more sort of looser networks. And the reason that can exist is because of these big institutions that are pushing these monetary units that we're using between ourselves in this web down here. Let's look at my home country of South Africa, for example. In the 1800s, there were tribal Zulu and Xhosa people. They would raise cattle and grow crops, and they didn't use money. They were actually self-sufficient. So contrary to what economists believe, where they imagine that everyone's just naturally trading all the time, Zulu and Xhosa people, their primary way of surviving was subsistence economies. It wasn't the market economy. How they became market economies was that a colonial power came in, the British, and they said, hey, we're going to introduce our money into the system, and the reason that you're going to have to take it is that you have to pay us tax in this money. In particular, it was called the hut tax. So they would go to the tribal groups and they say, you have to now pay us a certain amount of this money per hut that you have. And this created a demand for the money in these people who previously didn't use money. They now had to find this to pay this tax. And that meant the way they would get the money was to have to go try to work in the mines controlled by the colonial authorities. So actually, there isn't this separation between states and markets. Markets are underpinned by state foundations. So there isn't this imagined distinction between states and markets. And one of the biggest things that states do is introduce monetary systems which will actually take communities that were previously smaller and had their own kind of internal logic, and then break them up into these much bigger economies. So you've got to think about a modern capitalist economy as a massively scaled up version of interdependence, all right, compared to these much more tighter types of interdependence in smaller economies. And this is a much better way to think about economies more generally. Like, don't do what the economists do, which is imagine these sort of bumbling individuals who are trying to barter and stuff. It's a terrible way to think about economies.
Maar hoe pompt de overheid dan geld in die economieën zodat al die mensen met elkaar kunnen handelen? En kan je dat maar onbeperkt blijven doen? Hoe zorg je dat de economie goed blijft draaien?
Sometimes when I'm thinking about monetary systems, I think about them in 3 dimensions, with a vertical dimension and a horizontal dimension. Now, the vertical dimension are the big institutions, right? Imagine them pushing money down and pulling it back up. Right, these are your big money issuers, states and commercial banks. And then we are on this horizontal dimension. It's us on the ground doing business with each other. Basically, we're using this money that's being pushed into society and we're using it horizontally between ourselves. And you've got to think about the economy as this big network of people who are all entwined with each other. So, for example, let's say the US government wants to build a road system. The people who are actually going to build the road system are private sector contractors. What the government will do is it will instruct the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank in the US, to credit the accounts of those private sector contractors. And basically that'll manifest in their bank accounts as new money. All right? And from there, they'll then pay their workers, and so that new money will then spread around the economy. So historically, what's happening with nation states, governments, is that they're pushing money out, and in that process, they're actually expanding the ability of that network between us to actually get bigger, all right? And when they're pulling it back, they're kind of constraining it, in a sense, almost like choking it. So if you're imagining an economy as this interconnected network of people, you can then start to think about unemployed people as being people who are on the outside of that. They kind of want to get into it, they want to get entangled with everyone else, but they're not able to. All right? And so in this situation, what a government can do is to say, we're going to push more money out, and it can actually expand the network outwards. It can actually bring more people in. So if there is slack in the system, if there's capacity for the system to expand, actually you can push more money into society, and actually it'll help to bring people in. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying this, but at a sort of conceptual level, this is what's happening. And if they say, hey, actually the economic network is at a capacity, it's actually what they might say overheating, they can try to sort of pull money out and to sort of, in a sense, constrain it and kind of tighten the system up. So actually, in the conservative imagination, often they want to keep a certain number of people unemployed to keep inflation down. So one of the common accusations that's thrown at MMT is this idea that it promotes unconstrained government spending. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth, because in reality, what MMT actually says is that the real constraint in society is not how much money there is, it's how many people and resources there are. All right? So if there is slack in your economy, in other words, if there is capacity for it to actually expand, you can issue new money into that situation and it won't cause inflation. It doesn't say you can do unconstrained spending. It says the actual constraint is how many real resources and human beings you have in your economy. How many people are unemployed? How many people actually want jobs? And that's what we should be thinking about. We shouldn't be thinking in these artificially constrained terms about money. You should be thinking about the real constraints of human beings and resources.
Maar geld bijdrukken zoveel er kan, is dat niet te mooi om waar te zijn? Krijg je dan geen inflatie of hyperinflatie zelfs, zoals in Zimbabwe? In 2008 kon je daar 10-voudig miljardair zijn en toch maar nauwelijks genoeg geld hebben voor een flesje bier.
That's 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion, and then 700,000. That's 3.7 billion.
People often use the case of Zimbabwe to try warn about what will happen if we use MMT. But in reality, the Zimbabwe case actually proves many points around MMT. Now, I'm actually partly from Zimbabwe. My parents are from Zimbabwe. I've been in Zimbabwe during the hyperinflation. And what was actually happening in that situation was that the capacity of the underlying economy was collapsing. And in that context, the government was trying to push new money out. Now, that is a recipe for inflation. And that's how an MMT economist would think. They'd say, if your economic capacity is shrinking and you try to push new money into that situation, you're going to create inflation, right? Whereas if you have an expanding system or you have capacity that's available, actually it can do the opposite. So in many ways, Zimbabwe is not a kind of cautionary tale about what will happen if you do MMT. Actually, an MMT economist would really help you to understand what's happening in Zimbabwe in that context.
Hoeveel geld een overheid kan uitgeven, wordt dus bepaald door hoeveel ruimte er al dan niet is in de economie. De limiet is inflatie en werkgelegenheid, niet het huishoudboekje van de overheid. Maar waarom luidt dan steeds weer de alarmbel als de tekorten dreigen op te lopen?
Many countries will have rules which say things like, if you're going to push out this much, you're going to pull this much back in. And that's what paying for it means, really, in MMT terms. There's not an actual natural constraint on the amount of money that can be pushed out. Much like there's not a natural constraint on how many promises I can issue out. I can issue out as many promises as I want. There's not a natural constraint on that, but there can be a political constraint on that. You can have people saying, we will put artificial limits on that ability. And so this is what's happening, for example, with the debt ceiling in the US. It's an artificial political limit placed to there to essentially prevent the issuance of a certain amount of money or issuance of money beyond a certain point. It's not a natural limit, it's a political limit.
Secretary Janet Yellen sounded a warning in a letter to Congress last week, saying her department would need to have begun to take, quote, extraordinary measures to pay the government's bills.
If you're thinking about traditional debates between left wing and right wing, often they're debates about levels of taxation. So, for example, if traditional anti-austerity campaigners want to spend, they say, hey, tax the rich more, then we'll have the money to spend. MMT campaigners will often say something different, though. They say, we don't need to tax in order to spend. We have the ability to issue money out to spend. And actually, this is actually why MMT antagonizes both people on the left and on the right of the political spectrum, because it's kind of interfering in that traditional debate. You know, traditional tax justice campaigners, for example, will always be saying, we need to tax the rich so that we can spend. Whereas MMT says, actually, there's certain situations where we can spend without taxing. Depends on the situation. And so it actually will get attacked from all sides because of the fact that it's messing in that traditional battle between left and right. There's multiple reasons for tax in an MMT framework. The two primary reasons are to anchor the money supply by creating demand for your money by saying you're going to put it back. Okay, that's a sort of foundational reason for tax in MMT. But there's other reasons as well. They might use it to rebalance inequality in a society, to say, hey, there's too much wealth here and too little here. So this is redistributional uses of tax. But you can also use tax for certain types of incentives, to say, hey, we want to stop certain types of behavior. Now that's, tax in general has multiple uses to it. So, but in an MMT framework, the primary understanding of tax is that you're using it to pull money out of circulation to help deal with inflation, but also to free up resources for the public sector to use.
Zo'n politieke afspraak over hoe groot het tekort en de schuld van een land mogen zijn, die hebben we ook in Europa. Voor de euro tot stand kwam, werd er stevig gevochten over hoe streng of juist hoe soepel die regels voor de begroting moesten zijn. Vooral door Frankrijk en Duitsland, die daar elk een heel andere mening over hadden.
Diese Entscheidung ist eine erstklassige Entscheidung, es ist eine gute Entscheidung, die Stabilität gewährt. Die Menschen in Irland wissen, dass sie eine stabile Währung, keine reiche Währung, eine harte Währung bekommen. Und sie wissen auch, das war nur möglich, wenn wir uns aufeinander zubewegt haben, nicht zuletzt die Franzosen und die Deutschen. Deswegen bin ich auch Jacques Chirac sehr dankbar, dass ungeachtet seiner innenpolitischen Schwierigkeiten diesen Schritt gegangen ist.
The Eurozone actually does work according to how MMT describes the money system. All right, governments do spend money into existence and pull it out, but they have much tighter constraints. So they're required to not run budget deficits more than 3% of GDP. All right, so they can only spend a certain amount of money into existence. And also they have strict limits on how much debt they can have relative to GDP. In the Eurozone, you have this thing, which is you have a central bank and it's given its power by all the different national governments, but in a sense, they're kind of subordinated to the central bank. So they're given up their power to it and they don't actually have any ability to override its decisions. So this means when there's crises, it's very, very hard for an individual government to try to use any fiscal power to get out of that crisis, which means they have to bargain with all the other governments. And that's all these power relations come in. So for example, Germany has a lot of power. And they can start to make demands.
Wir haben einen Vertrag, in dem heißt es, dass es nicht die Möglichkeit gibt, Staaten rauszukaufen, ihnen aus der Klemme zu helfen. Das heißt, wir können Griechenland im Augenblick dadurch am besten helfen, dass wir deutlich machen, Griechenland soll seine Hausaufgaben machen, so wie es auch im Augenblick angelegt ist.
And so a lot of the Eurozone crisis was a situation where in many ways it was very unfair. The German government demands certain things, it imposes austerity on one of the member states. But when a crisis hits, like the pandemic, for example, suddenly they can change those rules. And they say, actually, it is possible to issue new money.
The lockdown of our public life is necessary to contain the virus, but it also slows down severely our economy. Today, and this is new and never done before, we trigger the General Escape Clause. That means national governments can pump into the economy as much as they need.
Dus als het politiek uitkomt, dan pompen regeringen gewoon geld in hun economie. Of ze dat nou MMT noemen of niet.
When you first approach MMT, you should think about it as being a descriptive framework. It's a way of describing what happens in a monetary system. Now, that doesn't mean that actual state authorities will be thinking like that themselves. Often state authorities are using redundant neoclassical models of what they're doing, right? Those models are often inaccurate, but de facto, when a government's spending, it's creating money. And de facto, when they're taxing, it's destroying money, right? MMT describes that. Whether or not state authorities think that they're doing that is a separate question. Okay, so you don't need to be an MMT supporter to create money. Right? States are doing it all the time, regardless of whether they believe in MMT or not.
There's nothing to prevent the federal government from creating as much money as it wants and paying it to somebody.
If you're actually working in the nitty-gritty operations of central banks, you will understand everything that MMT says, because you see it happening in front of you. It's only in the political domain that this is controversial. So when Donald Trump is authorizing the US government to spend on the border wall with Mexico, he's quote unquote doing MMT. But Donald Trump hates MMT. He thinks it's some kind of crazy loony theory, but he's doing it all the time, right? Because he's doing something that the US government can do, which is issue money. And this is where that metaphor around Copernicus, comes in. In the 12th century, people didn't believe that the earth revolved around the sun, and they could go about their lives with the belief that actually the sun was revolving around the earth, but that wasn't a reality. So similarly, many governments or politicians actually do believe that you have to tax and stuff in order to spend, but still, that's not a reality. The reality is the opposite.
Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
The reason why people often think MMT is a political prescriptive theory is that when it's describing the monetary system in a different way, it opens up the imagination. It opens up people's ability to say, oh, what can we actually do with this system that we previously thought that we couldn't do? In much the same way that if you suddenly realize that the earth revolves around the sun, it opens up a bunch of possibilities for thinking about things. Let's think about space travel. Let's think about, actual physics and stuff. In a similar way, if you start to describe the actual operations of the monetary system, you start to be able to think more creatively about it. It doesn't just mean you're going to spend money endlessly. It means you actually have a sort of finer set of tools to think about when is it appropriate to spend, when is it appropriate to pull money out. So actually it helps even conservatives if they start thinking like this.